It's a distinct honor and very much a personal pleasure to be here this evening. And our topic is drawn from the second of my 2-volume work on General Hood. We're going to take a look in comparison and contrast of 2 important and tragically flawed frontal assaults by Confederates during the war. Mary Elizabeth, we're always going to be a little trepidatious as we advance the slides. Dr. King, of course, said longevity has its place, and I'm happy to remind us and myself that this is my 6th time over the decades to address this group. I once was on a program at the Fort Benning National Military Museum with a survivor of a Vietnam prison camp. And of course, we had to ask him, how did you survive? He said 2 things, luck and calories. Well, gentlemen, ladies, I'll say the same thing about my longevity. It's just luck and calories. A bit of history. What goes around comes around. It's interesting that in the mid-'80s, the late Tom Watson Brown and the late Colonel Bogle and I got together and said, we're the only major roundtable without a book award. So Tom went to the executive committee, got the okay to form a book committee. We put our heads together. What shall we name it? Like New York has the Fletcher Pratt Award, etc. So we came up with Richard Barksdale Harwell. Tom called Rick, who was at the Harvard Library at Georgia, and Rick said, sure, you can use my name, so long as it's the full name, Harwell, because he was very proud of his Mississippi ancestors, so he wanted to call it the Richard Barksdale Harwell Award. And I always honor the late Dr. Harwell by referring it to as the Richard Barksdale Harwell Award. And every November, we would meet at the Colonnade, that ancient restaurant there at Piedmont and Lindbergh, I guess. And we'd bring a couple of 3 books, argue it out, vote. Tom would take it to the executive committee, and that would be the next year's Harwell Award. So I'm happy now, late in life, to be able to receive the award that I helped organize. As I was telling some folk, my manuscript on General Hood bled into 2 volumes. This is the second one, which carries Hood into Tennessee, as our title states. A few words on our work. I didn't intend it as a biography, kids. Richard McMurray had done that back in '82. What I wanted was a study of Hood's generalship. 6 months as Corps Commander with the Army of Tennessee, 6 months as Army Commander, July to 64 to January of 65. But because I had a prologue and an epilogue on Hood's life before and after 64, people have viewed it as a biography. That's okay. We just wanted to write about General Hood. Here's my first volume, which carries him to the surrender of the city. We can summarize Hood's rise to fame and promotion in the Confederate Army. He entered as a lieutenant of cavalry. As Charlie said, he was with the 2nd out in Texas. In May of 61, he was assigned to Virginia, promoted to major, and he for a while actually commanded Magruder's horse arm down on the peninsula. In October of 61, he shifted to the infantry, and because of that service in Texas, remember, as Charlie told us, he was a Kentuckian by birth, but because of that several years out in Texas, they thought, okay, we've got a couple of 3 Texas regiments were migrating to Virginia. One of them was the 4th, and Hood got the nod. Then, in March of 62, when Brigadier General Lewis Wigfall wanted to go to the Senate, they promoted Hood from Colonel of the 4th to the Brigadier General and gave him the Texas Brigade. Born in 1831 in Kentucky, as I say, he was a West Pointer, but not with a particularly illustrious academic record. 2nd Cavalry on the Texas frontier in the mid-1850s. And then, as I say, he was promoted rather rapidly through the ranks, cavalry, infantry, to Brigadier General of Infantry in Lee's Army, then in Johnston's. Hood's brilliant season, of course, was the spring and summer of 62, when he led the Texas Brigade on foot and personally in the charge that broke Fitzjohn Porter's mine at Gaines Mill. He did the same thing. This time he had a small division at 2nd Manassas. He participated in Longstreet's attack. And if you're a fan of John Hennessy's book, Return to Manassas, you will remember John's statement that this was as close as Bob Lee came to destroying an enemy army, with Longstreet's massive attack against Polk's flank with fully 25,000 Confederate infantrymen. At Sharpsburg, Hood's division is on the left, and when Hooker's 1st Corps begins the battle's attack against the Confederate left, it's Hood's division that counterattacks, stabilizes the situation, and probably saves Lee's army from crumbling from left to right. After that, Jackson, who was the wing commander, was so impressed with Hood and the Hood's Texas Brigade that Jackson personally advocated for his promotion, which came a month after the battle, and he was given a division in Longstreet's Corps. Here's a story that I tell in my first volume, and it shows General Lee's capacity as an observant administrator. On November 7, 62, the day after Hood's promotion was announced, Lee's Inspector General toured Hood's camp and found much to be disappointed and disagreeable. Indifferently policed camps, the men were poorly clothed, shoed, arms were mixed in bad order with a mishmash of ammunition. Lee took the unusual step of having his Chief of Staff, Colonel Chilton, write Hood a letter of reprimand, accusing him and his officers of inexcusable neglect. Now, y'all know Bob Lee as well as I do. This is as close to a reprimand as General Lee will give, particularly to a division-level brigadier general. But the point is, Bob Lee would remember this about Hood, and it would come back to haunt. Hood's raw ambition. You know, this is not the first time that you have heard this about Bell Hood. His ambition exceeded his level of competence. He always wanted higher rank. And he wasn't ashamed to connive for it. He missed Chancellorsville while he was with Longstreet down in Suffolk. He writes the Army commander over his Corps commander. He said, hey, if you get some reinforcements, will you think of me? Lee replied in gentlemanly form, but did not refer to this request by Hood. Then, after Jackson's death, Hood was even more brazen, seeking promotion to Corps commander to replace Jackson. But Lee, remember that inattention to administrative detail that Lee noticed in the fall of 62? This time Lee passes over Hood and gives the Corps command, as we know, to Ewell and to Hill. But he did write the president saying, Dick Anderson and Bell Hood are promising officers, they're improving, but they're not at Corps level yet. At Gettysburg, as you know, Hood was wounded in the arm. How many people are familiar with Sam Hood's lost papers? You know that Sam Hood, a distant relative of the general, living in Huntington, West Virginia at the time, was reached out by a family in Philadelphia, the Thomas family, and they said, you know, we've got something in our attic that we think you might like. So Sam's, of course, drove to Philadelphia, went up to the attic, came down, ghost struck. You don't know what you have. They had the trunk of Hood's personal papers that had passed through the family. No one knew about it. Exactly. Yeah. And he essentially said, this is my driver's license. Can I take these to the Xerox store? And they said, you can do more than that. Ted Savas came to the rescue, and the lost papers have been published. And in them is Dr. John Darby's medical log. Dr. Darby treated the wound. So we know exactly how Hood was wounded at Gettysburg. A shell burst overhead, and a ball struck him in the left arm. This overturns what even McMurray thought that he got from New Orleans relatives of Hood. So the Darby medical record is a real find. And kids, it comes in our lifetime. It's really huge to be a Civil Warrior right now. The musculature was damaged, but the bone was not scrapped. They didn't have to amputate, but the left arm would remain useless largely to Hood for the rest of his life. With his arm still in a sling, he shot again, but this time in the right leg, upper thigh. That had to be amputated that night. Not much left of Hood. Hood convalesced in Richmond, November of 63, February of 64. But it is notable, ladies and gentlemen, that even though Hood and his division had been sent to join Bragg at Chickamauga, when Hood came back to Virginia, General Lee did not ask for his return to the Army. He kind of thought, you know, General Hood had reached his level of capacity as division commander, and now that he is impaired, I think I can find more promising officers as division commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia. Instead, Longstreet and Bragg, who had been impressed with Hood at Chickamauga, recommended his promotion to lieutenant general. About that time, Joe Johnston was asking for a corps commander, and if you know President Davis, he did not advocate the promotion to lieutenant general unless there was a corps command vacancy somewhere in the Confederate forces. This gave Davis the chance to recommend him to the Senate. About that time, Hood was saying, hey, I've been convalescing now for 5 months. I'm ready to return to the field, which was pretty manly admission at that. The fact that Hood was probably during the winter trucking up with the President Davis. Remember, they were personal friends. At times, Davis would help Hood on crutches down the steps of the Episcopal Church where they both worshiped in Richmond during the winter of 63-64. And Mary Chestnut noticed Hood as the awkward flatterer sucking up to the press. Now to our topic. General Lee and Bell Hood have something in common. Both have been severely criticized for the frontal attacks that they authorized and ordered. Lee on the third day of Gettysburg, and as Charlie mentions, Hood at Franklin. Let's summarize both battles. June of 63, Lee is marching into Pennsylvania. He wants a decisive battle. As you know from Ted Turner's Gettysburg film, the first day went well with us, and Lee decided to commit to a second day in which Longstreet would attack the Federal left and Ewell the Yankee right. As you know, the attacks pushed the Yankees back, especially to places like Little Round Top, Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, but they did not break the Federal line. July 3, Lee ordered an assault on Meade's center. This is Pickett's charge, but it's really the charge of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble, because after a 2-hour artillery bombardment, 11 brigades, 11,700 men, by the best we can count, were assembled, and charged the Federal center. Only a small remnant actually reached the Yankee line, the stone wall. That's Low Armistead's brigade. And the casualties, 6,867 Confederates KWM in the repulse of Pickett's charge. Now, Hood's decision at Franklin. After the fall of Atlanta, let's put ourselves in Hood's place. What options did he have? He couldn't sit out in the field and wait for Sherman to come and attack him, nor could he attack Sherman in the fortifications of Atlanta. President Davis visited Hood in Palmetto circa September 26, 27. There is strong evidence that they hatched their Tennessee plan, whereby Hood would march into North Georgia, maybe lure Sherman into an open field fight, but if not, then march into North Alabama and eventually Tennessee, seeking again some kind of offensive that would restore Confederate morale and might even bring Tennesseans back into the ranks. The problem was that Dick Schofield, with about 23,000 men, lay between Hood and Nashville. November 29th at Spring Hill. Hood thought he had a trap set for Schofield with some of his divisions to attack Schofield. They did not. On the late afternoon and into the evening of November 29th, Schofield slipped away through the night and took position at Franklin. Morning of November 30th, Hood and his army followed Schofield to Franklin, 12 miles away, and that afternoon Hood ordered the frontal assault that we will be talking about, with all of his available infantry. Some 18,000 Confederates, eventually 21K, with some of S.D. Lee's men, arrived late in the afternoon. At points, the Confederate assault reached and penetrated Schofield's lines in bloody hand-to-hand fighting. But eventually, as we all know, the Confederate assault was repulsed with very lopsided casualties, 6,250 KWM against a third of that for Schofield. Both infantry attacks were colossal failures. Wiley's sword is particularly hard on Bell Hood, as you know. Calling Hood's attack at Franklin one of the most controversial orders in the history of American military. Gallagher, a good, strong supporter of Bob Lee, even terms the Pickett's charge decision Lee's worst of the war. Both assaults, before both assaults, here's another commonality. Before both assaults, the commanding generals were petitioned not to attack frontally, but to maneuver. As you all know, Longstreet's big beef with Lee July 2nd and 3rd was that Longstreet wanted to pull around to the south, take strong position maybe along Pipe Creek, and make Meade come and attack Lee. No. Lee wanted a strong battlefield victory, and after the near misses of July 2nd, he thought he could order it for July 3. And as Hood's army is approaching Franklin on the morning of November 30th, Forrest says, "General, I can take my troops and ride around Schofield's flank and get in his rear and block his route to Nashville." Hood said, "I don't want Schofield to retreat. In fact, I want to destroy him now, because if he goes to Nashville, he'll team up with Thomas, where Thomas had another 23,000 troops, and he would be too formidable an army to face." So Hood wanted what Lee wanted at Pennsylvania, a battlefield fight and a frontal attack that could deliver. Yet the charges at Franklin and Gettysburg have earned for Confederate soldiers gallantry, historic encomiums, as we all have heard growing up. From the late Stanley Horn, whose 1941 History of Army of Tennessee is still a good one to consult. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg has come to be a synonym for unflinching courage in the raw. The slaughter pen at Franklin even more deserves that gory honor. But there are tactical differences between the two assaults that I would like to point out to you all, and which come from my second volume. First, Lee was able to order a 2-hour artillery bombardment circa 1 p.m., 3 p.m. on July 3 to soften up the Federal line. Hood could not order such an artillery assault because in the advance to Franklin, most of his artillery was still to the rear and wouldn't come up to the Army until after the battle was over. But was this an important difference? I will suggest to you it ain't. Why? The Confederate bombardment only knocked out some Union guns, but not the ones on the main line that would be used to enfilade the infantry of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. Moreover, firing high, the Confederate artillery didn't even disrupt the infantry that was crouched behind the stone wall and preparing to receive the rebel attack. And finally, Porter Alexander, the chief of artillery on the field, was running low on ammo. And he was the one who said to Pickett, "For God's sake, charge. I can't support you if you don't do it now." Another difference, the length of ground to be covered by the Confederate infantry. In Gettysburg, it's 1 mile. In Franklin, it's 2. But ladies and gentlemen, I'll submit to you too that as with the case of the artillery bombardment, this really didn't matter. Because both sides began taking fire at about the same distance from the enemy line, 1,000 to 1,100 yards. In other words, that additional distance to be covered by Hood's infantry did not damage or weaken the charge. But a third difference was important. The nature of the fortifications held by the enemy. As you know, that along Cemetery Ridge, the Yankees had a low stone wall and not much more than that. But Schofield had dug in with earthworks, parapets, abattis, preliminary ditches. That proved to be a really big difference between what Hood faced and what Pickett faced. Numbers engaged. Look at this. Bet you haven't thought about this. Hood and Schofield were roughly equal in size, with the various historians pitching them along those lines, 21 to 23,000, but they were equal. Now, you take a look at the strength of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble against the strength of the Union organizations that they actually engaged with, and the Confederates held a 2-to-1 numerical advantage. People like George Stewart, who wrote the great Pickett's Charge book, have estimated that those 8 federal brigades plus 5 batteries numbered only 6,000 men, half of the Confederate attacking force. Much more important, Hood's, and I bet you haven't thought about this, Hood's attack front was a lot wider than Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. And why did this matter? Because it meant that the Confederate artillery on the flanks could not enfilade the Confederate infantry as it was advancing. Because as you see in this map, Hood's front extends along Schofield, and the Federal artillery is busy dealing with the rebels in front. But at Gettysburg, as I implied, it was the Union artillery that enfiladed the Confederate ranks and proved deadly. Jeff Wirt, who's written a good book on the third day of the battle. On Cemetery Hill, Ridge, and Little Round Top, Union gunners unleashed their fire. These crews could fire obliquely, enfilading the Confederate ranks. And as we all know, that's very deadly to infantry. More, and you know this, even Union infantry came out into the open field to fire enfilade musketry into the flanks. Vermont and Ohio regiments came out. As Coddington puts it, the shelling was bad enough, but now the musketry, the combined fire was too much. And as a result, the collapse of both flanks of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble is a major cause of the Confederate failure in the charge on July 3. Another key difference, Hood put all his available infantry into the charge. 18,000, eventually 21K, when those final 3,000 came up. But Lee did not. Here's from Andy Trudeau's history of the battle. As we all know, the three divisions had 11,000, maybe 11,700 men. But Trudeau posits, I think convincingly, that Lee wanted to throw in a secondary force of equal size. Pete Longstreet never did it. Note the number of Confederate casualties were about the same. Lee, 6,400. Hood, about the same. But Hood lost a lot more generals. As Charlie maintains, 12 KWM, including the 5 dead ones up there. Who's that? Hiram Granberry, Strahl, John Adams, can't remember, and then Pat Claver. Oh, yeah, statewide Gist in the middle. And by the way, I once knew a woman named Lucy Gist, and she said, "Steve, do you know who I'm descended from?" I said, "Lucy, I don't know." She said, "Well, I'm descended from statewide Gist." And I said, "Lucy, I can't believe my eyes have been so blind, because after 4 generations, she looks just like that photo." Honest, true story. And as Charlie maintains, the real loss was in regimental officers, 54, 55. Richard counts 55.
Okay.
What may we conclude about the 2 charges, ladies and gentlemen? Lee had a pre-assault artillery barrage, but it was ineffective. Hood employed more troops, indeed all of his available infantry. Hood's troops had a greater distance to cover, but came under fire at about the same point, so that greater distance did not really matter. Federals at Franklin were much better fortified. Hood's front length reduced the threat of enemy artillery enfilade, and at Gettysburg, Union artillery fire blasted the Confederate flanks and doomed Lee's assault. When all of these factors are balanced out, ladies and gentlemen, I'll maintain to you that both Lee's charge at Gettysburg and Hood's charge at Franklin enjoyed about equal chance of success. Think about that. Most important conclusion: even though both attacks failed, Lee and his army retreated 2 days after the battle. But Hood was able to claim victory because Schofield, skulking away in the middle of the night, gave Confederates possession of the field. So that circa December 1st, Hood is even issuing congratulatory orders to his army and announcing that we're going to advance on to Nashville. We've shown the enemy that we can clear him from the field. Today, Hood is not nearly so criticized, Lee is not nearly so criticized as Hood, General Imboden of the cavalry. If Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble had been supported as they were to have been, that ancillary or secondary force, the day would have been ours. To be sure, historians continue to criticize both generals for being overly aggressive on the battlefield. Richard Murray says it well in this book of essays dedicated to the Bell Wiley. Hood learned that frontal assaults at Gaines Mill, assaults at 2nd Manassas, assaults at Sharpsburg could clear the field and win victories. And he essentially did not budge from that tactical philosophy for the rest of the war. Alan Guelzo, who's written a very questionable biography of General Lee. Well, I'm not going to read that Yankees book on General Lee. Allen says in his book on Gettysburg, if Lee found a tactical trick that worked, he liked to keep using it until it broke. Only Guelzo would say that about Robert Edward Lee. But here's another important difference. Many overlook that Lee lost a higher percentage of officers and men in his attack. Of those 11,700, as I say, 6,200, 6,400, 54% of his strength. While Hood, of his 21,000, lost 6,250, an equal number, but a smaller percentage of his army. Bet you haven't thought about that either. An important note. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia recovered from Gettysburg, and even though it never again mounted a strategic offensive, it stayed together and fought for 2 more years. After Franklin, Hood led his army to Nashville and was routed in such disgrace and thoroughness that essentially the Army of Tennessee had disintegrated by the time it had retreated to North Mississippi. Conclusion. Hood today is blamed for the butchery at Franklin, which led to the destruction of Army of Tennessee. I think we'll all agree with that. But what about Bob Lee? He stands with Jesus and Elvis, kid. Clyde Broadway's Trinity steps hangs in the Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans. I went there specifically to ask about Clyde Broadway's painting. A woman behind me asked the docent, "Why is everyone talking about Clyde Broadway's Trinity?" I turned to the lady and said, "Where are you from, ma'am?" "Rhode Island." "You wouldn't understand." Thanks a lot, y'all. Yes, ma'am. This is good.
I'm going to have to go see you guys. But it's good to see you.
Questions?
Here. So,
On here.
you are the right, sir.
One thing that you didn't mention is I believe Lee's Army at Gettysburg was much better equipped and clothed than Hood's at Franklin. Would you comment on the effect that might have had?
Moreover, Lee's army has a greater state of morale than Hood's army, even though, especially amongst the Tennesseans, they were giddy that they were marching back into their state. But Hood's army was also still reeling from the loss of Atlanta, while Hood's army is coming off Chancellorsville. So you're right. Not only Hood's army is more numerous and better equipped, but enjoying a morale that even Meade's army did not have. You, sir.
If I correctly am putting your remarks together, at Franklin, Hood won because the enemy quit the field. But because 2 weeks later he loses at Nashville, that defeat, retroactively, shall we say, makes Franklin a defeat for him too, when it's really a victory.
Yeah, but the point that I like to make in my book, and good point, sir, is that after Atlanta, Hood's strategic problem was that he was running out of options. Remember, Jefferson Davis came down and they cooked up the march into North Alabama and Tennessee as the only option they had. But one of the points that I will also make is that when you are running out of options, the consequences of calamity are magnified if that option fails. And that's exactly what happened after Franklin at Nashville. Very good point.
Thank you.
Sir.
Steve, what about the weather? Summertime at Gettysburg, sun's out, hot is, you know what? Franklin, it's either raining cats and dogs the day before or it's raining during the battle. The river behind the Federals was swollen. Didn't Hood think that a frontal smash finished things off?
I don't think that it was raining on the afternoon of November 30th, but it had, because
The river couldn't be
the
crossed.
river was up.
Had to be Johnny Weissmiller to get away.
Yeah, that's right. Good point. And Pam, you and I are old enough to remember it.
Steve, I'm sad to say that I hadn't really thought about this before the Battle of Gettysburg, but obviously there had to be reserves. And you said that Longstreet refused to bring the 11,000.
According to Andy Trudeau.
So I'm just wondering if Lee had anything to do with that decision of not bringing the reserves up behind Vicksburg.
You know, and that's a good point, John. But let's remember Lee's style of generalship was shared by a whole lot. You think of your orders, you carefully distribute them, and then you trust your corps and division officers to execute them. And the proper role of the commanding general is therefore to seek a safe place within the observable rear and watch the battle plan unfold. I won't say that Lee was deficient in not being closer to the field and asking Pete, where are those divisions? Where are those? I won't say that Lee was deficient, but I will say that he was joined by a large club of both Union and Confederate general officers who had that style of generalship. Good point, John. Mary Elizabeth, have we skewered him? A question in the red. Matt.
Is there anything that Lee or Hood could have done differently that would have brought a different outcomes for the two of them?
In my opinion, no. Lee wanted the same, Hood wanted the same thing as Lee. He wanted a battlefield victory that could destroy Schofield and prevent Schofield from reinforcing Thomas at Nashville. He talked Forrest down when Forrest wanted to maneuver. He said, General, the time for maneuver is over. The enemy is there, and I will fight him. Essentially paraphrasing Lee at Gettysburg on the 2nd day of July. Good question, man.
Sir, who's to blame at Spring Hill for Schofield escaping?
Thanks, Perry. Frank Cheatham. And Sam Hood has amassed a lot of evidence. I think Wiley Sword was teetering in that question. And in my second volume, I spend a lot of time on Franklin, going through Cheatham's article in Southern Historical Society papers. Sam Hood has found stuff where officers after the war are writing Hood and say, you know what? I don't want you to go public, but I'm with you. It was Frank Cheatham. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be with you.